November 19th, 1954. 4:32 a.m. Highway 66, San Bernardino County. The sound came first, metal screaming against metal, a sound so violent it woke residents 3 blocks away. Then the smell. Burning rubber, gasoline spreading across asphalt like blood, the acrid bite of brake fluid mixing with desert air. Inside the crumpled black Cadillac Eldorado, Sammy Davis Jr., America's fastest tap dancer, the man who could execute 12 steps per second, hung suspended in that terrible space between consciousness and oblivion. His left eye socket was a catastrophe of torn tissue and exposed bone. The eye itself dangled by the optic nerve, a grotesque pendulum swaying with each shallow breath. The highway patrol arrived at 4:47. Officer Martinez later testified he'd never seen anyone lose that much blood and survive. The paramedics worked in practiced silence, their flashlight beams cutting through the pre-dawn darkness, illuminating something on the Cadillac's floor that would matter later. A gold Rat Pack ring, thrown under the driver's seat by the impact's force. By 6:15 a.m., Sammy was in surgery at San Bernardino County Hospital, the colored wing naturally, where the paint peeled and the equipment was 10 years outdated. The surgeon's prognosis was clinical, detached. He'll live, but he'll never perform again. Not like this. What the doctor didn't know, what nobody could have predicted, was that at exactly 10:43 that morning, when Sammy's remaining eye cracked open in the recovery room, he wouldn't be alone. Sitting in the vinyl chair beside his bed, suit rumpled from the overnight drive, cigarette burning between steady fingers, was Dean Martin. No cameras, no press. Just a man who'd driven 180 miles through the night because someone needed him. And what happened next? The money, the blood, the quiet acts of defiance that would reshape both their lives, started with 3 words Dean spoke into the antiseptic silence. "Kid, you're not done." This is the story of what those words cost, and why some debts can never be repaid, because they were never meant to be. Let us know where you're watching from, and we hope you enjoy the story. The Mojave Desert Highway stretched endlessly under the November moon, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through darkness that seemed to swallow everything whole. Sammy Davis Jr.'s hands gripped the steering wheel of his cream-colored Cadillac Eldorado with a desperation that had nothing to do with the speedometer climbing past 90. The car's headlights carved tunnels through the night, but they couldn't illuminate what he was running from. $15,000 lost on a single hand of blackjack. Money that wasn't his to lose. Money meant for medical bills he'd been hiding from everyone for months. The casino lights of Las Vegas receded in his rearview mirror like dying stars. Sammy's foot pressed harder on the accelerator. Not because he had somewhere to be, because shame has weight, and speed is the only thing that makes it feel lighter. What he didn't see was the woman in the Chrysler Imperial ahead, her brake lights flashing too late as she slowed for the highway construction nobody had bothered to mark properly. What he felt was the sickening crunch of metal, the world spinning in a kaleidoscope of chrome and glass, and then nothing but the taste of copper and the particular silence that comes just before your life splits into before and after. When consciousness returned, it came in fragments. The drip, drip, drip of an IV, chemical sting of formaldehyde, distant voices beyond a door that might as well have been miles away. Without $8,000 for the surgery and rehabilitation, he'll be permanently disabled. The doctor's voice carried the casual indifference of someone discussing damaged property. Who's going to pay that kind of money for a colored entertainer? Sammy lay in the segregated wing of the hospital, the colored section, where the paint peeled more noticeably and the sheets felt thinner, and understood with crystalline clarity that his career, the thing he'd built from nothing with sweat and talent and sheer refusal to accept limits, had just ended at age 28. The pain in his eye socket was excruciating, but worse was the mathematics of ruin. No insurance, no savings, just debt and darkness, and a future that looked like the empty highway he'd been speeding down. Then the door opened. Dean Martin entered without fanfare, without the cameras that usually followed the Rat Pack wherever they went. He wore a light gray suit that somehow stayed crisp despite the hospital's stale heat, and he moved with that particular loose-limbed grace that made everything look effortless. But his hands, Sammy noticed, were trembling slightly as he lit a cigarette. "Kid," Dean said, settling into the vinyl chair beside the bed, with a heaviness that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. Hospitals terrified him, had ever since his mother's long illness. "I heard you were trying to drive faster than me. That was your first mistake." Sammy tried to laugh. It came out as something between a cough and a sob. Dean took a long drag, exhaling smoke toward the water-stained ceiling. "The second mistake was thinking you had to handle everything alone." "Dean, Sammy's throat closed. "How do you explain gambling away your last chance? How do you admit you were so desperate to prove something to white promoters that you bet everything on feeling like you belonged? Save it." Dean's voice was quieter than Sammy had ever heard it, stripped of the performative smoothness he used on stage. "Hospital bills handled, surgery, rehabilitation, the whole ride. $8,247. The number hung in the antiseptic air like an impossible thing. "I can't. Dean, that's already done." Dean studied the burning end of his cigarette with intense concentration. "Paid it 4 hours ago, through a lawyer, anonymously." He looked up, and something in his eyes was almost angry. "You weren't supposed to know." A nurse had accidentally mentioned seeing a man in a gray suit, with the hospital administrator, papers being signed, a cashier's check that cleared immediately. Dean had never planned to tell him. He'd simply intended to disappear back into his life, leaving Sammy to wake up in a world where catastrophe had somehow been averted by forces unknown. "Why?" The word came out broken. Dean stood, crushing his cigarette in the metal ashtray with more force than necessary. His hands were still shaking, not from nerves now, but from something deeper, something that looked like it might crack him open if he let it. 2 months ago," Dean said slowly, "I saw you in the dressing room at the Sands. You were hiding medical bills in your coat pocket. Didn't think anyone noticed." He moved toward the window, shoulders tight. "I notice everything about the people I care about, Sam. Everything." The afternoon light cut across Dean's face, revealing something that the stage lights and the careful image-making never showed. A man who remembered every small cruelty, every closed door, every time someone like them, Italian, black, anyone who didn't fit the narrow definition of acceptable, had been told they weren't quite good enough, quite white enough, quite human enough to deserve mercy. "You don't owe me gratitude," Dean said, still facing the window. "You owe yourself a second chance. Don't waste it." Then he was gone, leaving only cigarette smoke and the impossible fact of salvation, and Sammy lying in a hospital bed in the colored wing, understanding for the first time that some rescues aren't about heroism at all. They're about one man who knows exactly how it feels to be drowning, throwing a rope to another before the water closes over his head. The hospital days blurred into a rhythm of pain and morphine, punctuated by Sammy's growing understanding of what Dean had actually done. A nurse mentioned it casually while changing his bandages. $247, was exactly what Dean Martin made for 2 weeks of shows at the Copa Room. 2 weeks of his life, handed over as easily as signing a check. But the worst detail came from an orderly who'd overheard the booking agents talking. Dean had canceled his family's Christmas trip to Ohio. The Martins always went home for the holidays. It was the one tradition Dean never broke, flying back to Steubenville to see his aging father, to eat his mother's cooking, to remember who he'd been before the lights and the money. This year, he'd called them to say he couldn't make it. Had to work extra shows. Never mentioned why. Sammy stared at the ceiling tiles and felt something curdle in his chest that wasn't quite gratitude, wasn't quite shame. It was the terrible weight of being loved more than you'd earned. Jack Entratter arrived on a Thursday, wearing the kind of smile that made Sammy's skin crawl. The Sands casino manager carried a leather portfolio and moved with the predatory patience of someone who'd spent decades watching desperate men make bad decisions. "Sammy, sweetheart." Entratter settled into the visitor's chair without invitation. "I've got good news. We can make your little gambling problem disappear." He opened the portfolio with theatrical flourish. 15,000 in debt. Gone. Wiped clean. "All you gotta do is sign right here." The contract was 50 performances at reduced rates. Sammy's eyes tracked the numbers. Where he should make 3,000 a week, this paid 800. 2 years of his life, locked in at rates that wouldn't even cover a studio apartment in a decent neighborhood. "There's just one thing," Entratter added, his voice honey-smooth. "The prosthetic eye procedure. The cosmetic one that actually looks real? That's 3,000 extra. Not covered by your hospital stay. Without it." He shrugged. "Well, let's be honest. Nobody wants to watch a one-eyed Negro dance. Bad for business." Sammy read the contract 3 times. The mathematics were designed perfectly. He'd never earn enough to afford the prosthetic while locked into these rates. He'd be trapped performing half-blind. Forever the curiosity act. Never the star. Financial servitude dressed up as mercy. His hand shook as he signed. What choice did he have? Dean Martin entered Sammy's hospital room at 11:30 that night, and he was genuinely, catastrophically drunk. Not the performative stumbling he did on stage, the real thing. His suit jacket was missing, his tie loosened, and when he spoke, the Italian accent he'd spent years burying surfaced like something clawing its way out of a grave. "You signed it." Not a question. Dean swayed slightly, gripping the doorframe. "You actually signed Entratter's shit contract." "I didn't have a choice." "There's always a choice." Dean's voice cracked through the quiet ward. A nurse appeared in the doorway, alarmed, but Dean waved her off with a gesture that was more plea than dismissal. "You think I paid for your hospital so you could become a goddamn slave?" Sammy had never seen Dean like this. Unpolished, raw, the careful veneer stripped away entirely. Dean lurched forward, pulled the contract from the bedside table where Sammy had left it, and began to read. His lips moved silently, and with each clause, his face darkened. 1946, Dean said quietly, almost to himself. "I was 29. Thought I'd finally made it." He looked up, and his eyes were somewhere else entirely, somewhere dark. Sat in an office that smelled like cigars and fear. 3 men in good suits, who owned pieces of every club that mattered. They slid a contract across the desk. Said it would make me a star. He let the paper flutter to the floor. I signed it because I was nobody. Just Dino Crocetti from Ohio. And they were offering me the world. His laugh was bitter, chemical. "You know what that contract cost me? 15% of everything I've ever made. Still paying them. Every album, every show, every movie. They get their piece. Will until the day I die or they do. Sammy felt something cold spread through his chest. Dean? I didn't know. Nobody knows. Dean moved closer, and the smell of old-fashioned, his drink, always his drink, was overwhelming. That's the point. They own you so completely you don't even complain about it. You smile and perform and hand over your percentage like a good little dancing monkey. He picked up Sammy's contract with 2 fingers like it was contaminated. I won't let you become what I am. The sound of tearing paper filled the small room, deliberate, vicious. Dean ripped the contract into smaller and smaller pieces, letting them fall like confetti around the hospital bed. The nurses in the hallway stopped talking. Somewhere down the corridor, a phone was ringing, unanswered. Tomorrow, Dean said, his voice steadier now, sharpened by purpose. Entratter's gonna come back. He's gonna be angry. He's gonna threaten you. He pulled out his checkbook, monogrammed, expensive leather, and began writing. His hand trembled, but not from alcohol, from rage. You're gonna give him this, 15,000 for your gambling debts. Clean slate. Dean, that's... And you're gonna tell him, Dean continued, ignoring the interruption, that if he ever tries this shit again with you or anyone else, the Rat Pack will never work another night in any venue he's connected to. Not the Sands, not the Copa, nowhere. He signed the check with a flourish and placed it on the bed. You don't owe me your freedom, Sam. You don't owe me gratitude. But you owe yourself better than this. Dean moved toward the door, steadier now, as if the act of tearing up the contract had sobered him. My mother used to say, Quando aiuti qualcuno, fallo perché è giusto, non perché ti rende speciale. He paused at the threshold. When you help someone, do it because it's right, not because it makes you special. The door closed softly behind him, leaving Sammy alone with torn paper scattered across white sheets and a check that represented another 2 weeks of Dean Martin's life, given away like it cost nothing at all. But it cost everything. And that was precisely the point. December 22nd, 1954. The prosthetic eye surgery was scheduled for 11 the following morning. Christmas Eve, when most of the hospital staff would already be mentally halfway home. Dr. Richard Chen, the chief ophthalmologist, had examined Sammy twice, mapped out the procedure with reassuring precision, promised that within 6 weeks he'd look almost exactly as he had before the accident. Almost. At 9 p.m., a different doctor appeared in Sammy's doorway. Younger, nervous, avoiding eye contact. Dr. Chen won't be performing your surgery. The words came out rehearsed. He's withdrawn from the case. Personal reasons. Sammy understood immediately. Personal reasons meant the other doctors had made it clear that operating on a Negro patient, giving him priority during the Christmas week, using resources that could go to white patients, was professionally inadvisable. Personal reasons meant Chen had a family to feed and a career to protect, and Sammy Davis Jr. wasn't worth either. The replacement surgeon they offered was fresh out of medical school, had performed the procedure exactly twice, and made it very clear through tight-lipped sentences that he was doing this under protest. We can attempt the surgery on the 27th, he said, after the holiday, after all the white patients had been seen, after Christmas, after it stopped mattering quite so much. Sammy lay in the darkness after the doctor left and felt the future he'd been clutching at slip through his fingers like sand. Without the prosthetic, he'd be a carnival act, a curiosity, the one-eyed dancer. Every audience would be looking at what was missing instead of what remained. At 11:17 p.m., Sammy heard the unmistakable growl of a Lincoln Continental pulling into the hospital's emergency bay. Then voices, Dean's, sharp with authority, and another he didn't recognize. Footsteps in the corridor, moving with purpose. Dean entered first, still in his stage clothes from that night's show, bow tie undone. Behind him came a man in his 50s, silver-haired, carrying a medical bag that looked like it cost more than most people's cars. "Sammy, this is Dr. Herman Tarnower. Flew him in from New York." Dean spoke quickly, efficiently. "He's performed this surgery 237 times. He's the best." Dr. Tarnower extended his hand. His grip was firm, clinical, measuring. "Mr. Martin's description of your case was compelling. But I need to be direct. I cannot perform this surgery here." Sammy's heart sank. "Not because I won't," Tarnower continued, "but because this hospital's administration has made it clear that my presence is not welcome. Something about protocol and insurance liability." His expression suggested exactly what he thought of those excuses. "However, there's a private clinic in Henderson, 20 miles from here. Jewish community runs it. They've agreed to provide the facilities." Dean moved to the window, his back to them both. "We leave in 30 minutes. I'm checking you out AMA, against medical advice. You'll sign the papers. We'll handle the rest." "Dean, you can't just watch me." At 2:47 a.m., Sammy found himself in an operating room that smelled of new paint and the particular kind of hope that comes from buildings created out of necessity. The clinic was small, clean, funded by people who understood what it meant to be turned away from hospitals that should have helped. Dr. Tarnower scrubbed in while explaining the procedure in detail, perhaps more detail than Sammy wanted, but the doctor's voice was steady, confident, and that mattered more than comfort. "We'll need to work quickly," Tarnower said. "The infection risk increases every hour we wait." The surgery began. Sammy drifted in and out of consciousness under local anesthetic, aware of pressure, of voices, of the bright surgical lights that seemed to bore straight through his skull. Then Tarnower's voice, sharp with concern. "We have a problem. There's infection in the orbital cavity. Worse than the scans showed. We need whole blood, and we need it now. A B negative. The clinic doesn't have it in storage." A pause that felt like falling. "I'm AB negative." Dean's voice, from somewhere beyond the surgical lights. "Mr. Martin, do you understand what you're—" "Take what you need." Sammy tried to speak, to protest, but the anesthetic had his tongue. He could only listen as they prepared Dean. As the nurse explained the risks, Dean had been working 12-hour days. His own health wasn't optimal. Donating a pint could cause complications. "Stick the needle in," Dean said quietly. Through the haze, Sammy saw them. Dean on a gurney beside the operating table, his sleeve rolled up, his face turned toward the ceiling because he couldn't watch blood. Not his own, not anyone's. Had been that way since childhood. The rhythmic beep of the machines. The whisper of blood flowing through plastic tubing. Dean's hand, clenched tight around a rubber ball, knuckles white with pressure. "You didn't have to do this," Tarnower said, monitoring Dean's vitals. Dean's laugh was dry, almost inaudible. "Yeah, I did." The surgery lasted 4 hours. When Sammy woke, properly woke, the sun was rising through the clinic windows, and Dean was gone. A nurse mentioned he'd left at 6 a.m. "He has a show at 8, she said, adjusting Sammy's IV. "Copa room. Wouldn't cancel it." Sammy closed his eyes, his eye, singular now, and imagined Dean on stage, pale beneath the stage makeup, holding notes that should have been effortless, performing on sheer will because the show had to go on. Because 200 people had bought tickets. Because Dean Martin never missed a performance. Because somewhere beneath the sequined jackets and the Playboy image and the practiced nonchalance was a man who'd learned young that you never show weakness, never admit pain, never let them see you bleed, even when you literally just did. Years later, Sammy would notice a small scar on Dean's right arm, just inside the elbow. Dean would never mention it, would change the subject if asked. But Sammy would know exactly where it came from, would remember the sound of blood moving through tubing at 4 in the morning, would understand that some debts aren't paid with money at all. They're paid with the stuff that keeps you alive, given freely in the darkness when nobody's watching, when there's no applause, no recognition, nothing but the terrifying possibility that it still might not be enough. But you give it anyway, because that's what love looks like when it's real. January 15th, 1955. Sammy stood in the rehearsal studio at the Sands Casino, staring at his reflection in the wall-length mirror. The glass prosthetic eye the doctors had fitted looked almost perfect from a distance. Same warm brown as his natural eye, carefully painted iris, even a few realistic blood vessels traced across the white. But it didn't move, couldn't move. When his real eye tracked left, the artificial one stared straight ahead, creating a discordant disconnect that made him look less like a performer and more like something from a wax museum. He attempted his signature move, the triple tap step with a full rotation that had brought down houses from Harlem to Hollywood. His right foot struck the floor, left foot followed, then the spin. The world tilted violently. His inner ear screamed conflicting messages. Without depth perception, without the coordination his body had spent 28 years perfecting, he was nothing but flailing limbs and desperate hope. He hit the floor hard, shoulder taking the impact, and for the first time since the accident, he wept. Not quiet tears, but the raw, ugly sobbing of someone watching their entire identity crumble. The studio door opened. Sammy expected Dean, but the man who entered was older, compact, moving with a dancer's perpetual readiness. Gene Kelly, wearing rehearsal clothes and an expression that suggested he'd seen this exact despair before. "Dean called me yesterday," Kelly said, setting down his bag. "No introduction, no pleasantries. Said you needed to learn how to cheat physics." Sammy wiped his face with the back of his hand. "I can't even stand up straight." "Not yet." Kelly walked to the mirror, examined Sammy's stance with clinical precision. 1943, I lost 2 toes on my left foot. Industrial accident during a war bonds show. You know how many people know about it? He held up a closed fist. 0. Because I rebuilt every movement from the ground up. Taught myself to balance on 8 toes instead of 10. He extended his hand, pulled Sammy upright with surprising strength. Your body's trying to use information that's not there anymore. We're going to teach it new rules. It's going to hurt worse than anything you've experienced. And when you think you can't do another hour, we're doing 3 more. Kelly wasn't exaggerating. 8 hours a day, 6 days a week. They started with basics that felt humiliating. Walking in a straight line, turning without falling, standing on one foot. Kelly was merciless, a perfectionist who accepted nothing less than precision. "Again!" he'd shout as Sammy crashed into the bar for the 15th time. "Again! Again! Again!" But every night, at 11:07 p.m., Sammy knew, because he started watching the clock, Dean would appear. He never said much, would slip into the back of the studio, light a cigarette, settle into one of the folding chairs against the wall. Sometimes he'd doze off, head tilted back, exhausted from his own performances. Sometimes he'd just sit, smoke curling up toward the ventilation grates, watching. Sammy learned from Gene Kelly's assistant that Dean had canceled his Chicago engagement, a 3-week run that would have paid $25,000. When his manager Herman Citron found out, he'd stormed into Dean's dressing room, threatened to quit. Dean's response, according to the showgirls who'd overheard, "Then quit. The kid needs to see someone believes in him more than money." February bled into March. Sammy's feet bled literally. Blisters upon blisters, toenails blackening and falling off, muscles screaming from the constant compensation his body was making. But slowly, incrementally, he began to understand his new center of gravity. Learned to turn his head slightly before spinning, giving his eye time to process. Discovered that leading with his left side gave him better control. March 12th, the test performance. A closed showing in the Copa Room for casino executives, booking agents, the people who'd decide whether Sammy Davis, Jr. still had a career or was just a cautionary tale. The room held 200 chairs. 93 were occupied. Sammy stood backstage, adjusting his eye in the mirror for the 10th time, and felt the familiar terror of being judged, of being found wanting. The announcer called his name. The stage lights were blinding, disorienting. He started with a standard routine, soft shoe, building toward the more complex movements. The audience was polite, scattered applause. He could feel their skepticism, their morbid curiosity about what a one-eyed dancer might look like. Then came the rotation sequence, the move that had destroyed him in rehearsal 100 times. He launched into the spin, faster than advisable, committing fully. His prosthetic eye popped out mid-turn, propelled by centrifugal force and poor adhesive. It hit the stage floor with a sharp crack and rolled, grotesquely, toward the front row. The sound seemed to echo forever in the sudden, absolute silence. Someone gasped. Sammy heard a chair scrape as someone stood to leave. He could stop, could apologize, run off stage, let the humiliation be complete. Instead, he bent down, picked up the glass eye with 2 fingers, and slipped it into his jacket pocket. Then he faced the audience, empty socket and all, and grinned. "Well," he said into the microphone, "guess we're doing this the hard way." And he danced. Not the smooth, polished routine he'd planned. Something rawer, harder, more aggressive. He let them see exactly what he was, damaged, imperfect, refusing to quit. Every tap was a declaration. Every turn was defiance. The empty socket became part of the performance, impossible to ignore, impossible to look away from. The music swelled. Sammy threw himself into a finale that should have been impossible. A series of complex rhythms that Gene Kelly said would take months to master. His body found the beats through muscle memory and sheer desperation. The final note hung in the air. Sammy froze, chest heaving, sweat pouring down his face. Then the room erupted. Not polite applause, standing ovation, whistles, the kind of response reserved for moments people would talk about for years. In the back row, barely visible in the dim light, Dean Martin sat motionless. And on his cheek, catching the reflection from the stage, a single tear, moving slowly downward. After 20 years in show business, after 1,000 performances and 1,000,000 practiced smiles, Dean Martin was crying because he'd just watched someone choose to be extraordinary instead of invisible. And that, more than any amount of money or blood or sacrifice, was worth everything. April 1955. The Copacabana contract arrived via telegram. $3,000 a week. 4 weeks guaranteed. It was the kind of booking that validated everything. The surgery, the rehabilitation, the fear. New York City. the room where legends were made. Sammy called the Warwick Hotel, where Copa performers traditionally stayed. Close to the club, luxurious, convenient. The desk clerk's voice was professional until Sammy gave his name. "I'm terribly sorry, Mr. Davis. We have a no-coloreds policy. Perhaps you might try elsewhere." Elsewhere meant Harlem. 90 minutes by subway each way, if the trains were running on time. Sammy booked a room at the Teresa Hotel. Nice enough, but the commute would mean leaving by 5 p.m. for an 8 o'clock show, getting back after 2 a.m., sleeping 4 hours, repeat. He told no one, just handled it, the way he'd learned to handle everything. 3 days into the run, Dean appeared backstage at the Copa. No warning, no explanation for why he was in New York instead of Vegas, where his own shows were scheduled. "Heard you're staying uptown," Dean said, lighting a cigarette. "Traffic's not so bad." Dean's expression suggested exactly how much he believed that. He left without another word. The next morning, Sammy received a call from the Warwick. "Mr. Davis, we'd like to offer you our sincere apologies for the misunderstanding. We've had a policy revision. A suite is available for you, complimentary, for the duration of your engagement." Sammy learned the details from a bellhop who'd witnessed Dean's visit to the hotel manager's office. 15 minutes behind closed doors. Dean's voice never raised, his tone conversational. But the message was clear. The Rat Pack, Dean Martin, Frank Sinatra, the most profitable entertainment act in the country, would never work another venue associated with the Warwick's ownership. Not in New York, not in Vegas, not anywhere. The math was simple. Maintain racism or maintain solvency. Not both. The Warwick chose money. They always did. November 1957. The Rat Pack officially formed. Dean, Frank, Sammy, Peter Lawford, Joey Bishop. Their first major contract, the Sands Casino, $100,000 for a week of shows. Revolutionary money. Life-changing money. Sammy read through the contract in his attorney's office, scanning the standard clauses about performance times, profit percentages, publicity obligations. Then, on page 7, paragraph 3, "Sammy Davis, Jr. shall maintain separate accommodations from other performers due to Nevada state segregation statutes." Separate accommodations meant the West Side Motel, the colored district, where the plumbing sometimes worked and the air conditioning never did. Frank saw the clause and went nuclear. "We don't sign this, we walk. They can't treat you like—" "We sign." Dean's voice cut through Frank's rage like ice water. Everyone turned. Frank's face was red with fury. "What the hell are you talking about?" Dean took the contract, found a pen, and signed his name with deliberate precision. "We sign, and then we break every rule they wrote." Opening night. The shows were electric. 3 hours of music, comedy, controlled chaos. At midnight, when the last applause faded, the Rat Pack gathered their entourage and walked, all of them, together, to Dean's suite on the top floor. The parties became legendary. Music until dawn. Celebrities, showgirls, journalists, anyone interesting enough to warrant an invitation. And Sammy, officially residing at the West Side Motel, unofficially present at every gathering, sleeping on Dean's couch most nights, becoming a permanent fixture in a hotel that had explicitly banned him. The Sands management was trapped. They couldn't shut down the parties without alienating their most valuable performers, couldn't enforce their own policy without looking like hypocrites. And Dean made sure every party was photographed, documented, impossible to deny. 3 weeks in, a memo circulated to Sands staff. Previous accommodation restrictions have been suspended pending policy review. No press release. No apology. Just a quiet erasure of a rule that could no longer be enforced without losing millions. Frank cornered Dean in the hallway one night, understanding finally clicking into place. "You magnificent bastard! You planned this from the beginning?" Dean exhaled smoke toward the ceiling. "You fight the system head-on, they fight back. But make it expensive to be racist? They fold every time." January 1960. Ocean's 11 filming began. Warner Brothers Studio, $2.8 million budget. Sammy had 17 pages of dialogue, equal billing. A real role, not a caricature. Then the memo appeared, leaked by a sympathetic script supervisor. Reduce Davis' screen time to minimize Southern theater boycotts. Dean read it twice, said nothing to anyone, just showed up for filming. The first scene without Sammy took 2 hours to shoot, routine coverage. Dean forgot his lines, repeatedly. Different lines each take, requiring full resets. The second scene, 8 hours. Director Louis Milestone was approaching a breakdown. "Dean, you did this perfectly in rehearsal." "Sorry, Lou. Let's go again." But scenes with Sammy? Dean was flawless. One take, maybe two. Efficient, professional, exactly what the studio expected from a 20-year veteran. By day 4, the assistant director had calculated the cost differential. Scenes without Sammy, burning through $20,000 in overages. Scenes with Sammy, ahead of schedule. Frank figured it out during a lunch break, watching Dean forget the same line for the 16th time. Their eyes met across the soundstage. Frank's grin was slow, appreciative. The final edit of Ocean's 11, Sammy appeared in 47 minutes of the 107-minute runtime. More than Joey Bishop, same as Peter Lawford. The studio had spent an extra $100,000 on Sammy's scenes without realizing it, and they couldn't cut footage they'd already paid for. Dean never acknowledged the sabotage, never explained the strategy, just kept showing up, kept forgetting lines, kept making racism more expensive than equality. On the last day of shooting, the script supervisor found a note tucked into Sammy's sides. "Make this perfect," written in Dean's handwriting next to every one of Sammy's scenes. Not a request, a command. Because Dean Martin understood something that activists and politicians often missed. People could be shamed into temporary change, but they could be bankrupted into permanent reform. Hit them in the wallet, and they stay hit. December 1960. Sammy Davis Jr. stood in his new Beverly Hills mansion. 8 bedrooms, Italian marble, a view that stretched to the Pacific, and felt nothing. The Copa room shows were generating $50,000 a week. His closet held custom suits from London, his driveway a cream Rolls-Royce that cost more than his father had earned in a lifetime. Success looked exactly like he'd imagined. So why did Dean Martin's Christmas invitation feel like an obligation he couldn't bear? "Just family this year," Dean had said on the phone. "My kids want to see you. Jeannie's making lasagna." "I'm booked, Dean. Big party at—" The lie came easily. Too easily. The party was at the Playboy Mansion. Champagne fountains, starlets, the kind of excess that proved you'd made it. Sammy worked the room, loud and confident, the one-eyed wonder who'd conquered impossible odds. When Frank Sinatra pulled him aside near midnight, concern evident beneath the casual question, "What's going on with you and Dean?" Sammy's response came out sharp, defensive. "I'm tired of being his charity case. Everyone thinks I owe him everything, like I didn't fight my way back myself." The waiter refilling champagne glasses was Angelo Maggio, who'd worked Vegas before moving to L.A., who happened to be Dean's cousin, who mentioned the conversation 2 days later during a family dinner. Dean's reaction, according to Angelo, silence. Then a slow nod. Then nothing. No calls, no visits. Just absence where presence had always been. May 1963. The Rat Pack performed at President Kennedy's inaugural celebration, a moment of cultural triumph. Afterward, a private reception at the White House. Sammy arrived with May Britt, his Swedish actress wife, their interracial marriage still scandalous enough that certain newspapers refused to publish their wedding photos. 4 drinks in, Sammy was holding court with a group of senators, retelling the comeback story. But the version that emerged was different. Smoothed edges, diminished details. The car accident was rough, sure, but I always knew I'd make it back. Dean helped out some, covered a few bills. But rebuilding my career? That was all me. You don't come back from something like that on someone else's dime. You do it with your own blood and sweat. He didn't see Dean standing 10 feet away, smoking by the window, until their eyes met in the reflection of a gilt mirror. The look on Dean's face wasn't anger. It was something worse, a kind of weary recognition, like watching a prediction come true that you'd hoped would prove wrong. Sammy's alcohol-fueled confidence evaporated instantly. He moved toward Dean, already forming an explanation, an apology, something to repair what he'd just broken. But Dean simply turned and walked out of the White House reception at 11 p.m. alone. No goodbye to the president, no word to Frank, just gone. Sammy tried calling the next day, and the day after. Dean's housekeeper was polite but firm. Mr. Martin isn't available. 2 years of silence followed, the kind of silence that's louder than any argument. August 1967. Angela Crocetti died in her sleep in Steubenville, Ohio. Dean's mother, the woman who'd taught him to cook, to sing, to understand that helping others was its own reward. The funeral was family only. A small Catholic church, closed ceremony, no press. Sammy saw the obituary in Variety. He booked a flight from Los Angeles without thinking, rented a car at the Pittsburgh airport, drove through rain that turned the Ohio hills into watercolor smears of gray and green. He stood outside St. Anthony's Church in his perfectly tailored black suit, hat in hand, rain soaking through to his skin. He didn't go inside. Couldn't. The distance he'd created over 3 years felt like a physical barrier, impossible to cross. So he just stood there. 2 hours. While the service happened without him, while Dean buried his mother, while the rain fell harder. When the church doors finally opened and mourners filed out, Dean appeared, surrounded by family. His face was carved from stone, unreadable. Then he saw Sammy, drenched, shivering, waiting like some penitent supplicant. Dean walked over. Up close, the lines around his eyes had deepened. He looked older than 50, worn by grief and time. "Dean, I'm so sorry about your mother, and I'm sorry for what I said at the White House. I was drunk and stupid and—" "She asked about you." Dean's voice was quiet, almost lost in the rain. "Every Sunday when I called, 'How's the kid with one eye? He's still performing?' She never forgot what you've been through." A pause. The rain drummed on the sidewalk between them. "She would have wanted you inside." They embraced, awkward at first, then genuine. Sammy felt Dean's shoulders shake slightly, grief breaking through the careful control. But something fundamental had shifted. They were friends again, yes, but not brothers. The easy intimacy, the unspoken understanding, the sense that they'd bleed for each other without question. That was gone, replaced by something more careful, more distant. Forgiveness had happened. Trust hadn't returned. As they separated, Dean's eyes held a truth they both understood. Some wounds heal, but the scars remain. Some distances, once created, can never fully close. And the cruelest irony, Sammy had spent 3 years resenting being saved, only to discover that resentment had cost him the one person who'd never asked for anything in return. In Dean's jacket pocket, pressed against his heart, were rosary beads his mother had given him as a child. Angela Crocetti had once told young Dino, in Italian he'd later translate, "When you help someone, don't expect gratitude, expect to be forgotten." She'd been right, as mothers often are, and Dean had learned the lesson well. December 1989. Cedars-Sinai Medical Center, Los Angeles. Sammy lay in a private room that smelled of antiseptic, and the particular stillness that accompanies the dying. Throat cancer, squamous cell carcinoma, stage 4. The doctors gave him 5 months, maybe 7. The chemotherapy had stolen his voice first, a cruel irony for a man who'd spent 60 years singing. Dean arrived on a Tuesday afternoon without announcement. He was 72 now, moving slower, his legendary constitution finally showing cracks. They hadn't been alone together in 3 years. Occasional phone calls, professional politeness, the friendship maintained at a careful distance. They sat in silence for 20 minutes. Dean in the visitor's chair, Sammy propped up on pillows, an oxygen tube under his nose. Finally, Sammy's voice emerged, a whisper, rough as gravel. "Dean, I never said thank you. Not really. For 1954. "You did." Dean studied the linoleum floor. "Every time you stepped on stage after that. That was thank you enough. But the White House. What I said? Kid, I stopped counting debts long time ago." Dean's interruption was gentle but firm. "You don't owe me nothing." Sammy watched Dean's face, saw something beneath the reassurance. "Then why you look at me like that?" Dean stood, moved to the window overlooking the Los Angeles skyline. The pause stretched long enough that Sammy thought he wouldn't answer. "Because you forgot what it cost." Dean's voice was barely audible. "Not the money. What it cost me to watch you almost die. Twice." The words hung in the chemical air of the hospital room, an admission that 35 years hadn't diminished the fear, hadn't erased the memory of standing beside an operating table at 4 in the morning, watching his own blood flow into someone else's body, knowing it might not be enough. May 16, 1990. Sammy's last day arrived with California sunshine that felt obscene in its brightness. Dean couldn't come, his own health failing, kidneys struggling, the depression that had followed his son's death in 1987 having hollowed him into someone barely recognizable. At 3 a.m., a courier arrived at Cedars-Sinai. Hospital quiet hours, when death visits most often. He carried a manila envelope, Dean's handwriting on the front. For Sammy Davis, Jr., Private. The night nurse, a woman named Patricia who'd been reading to Sammy when his vision failed, opened it carefully. Inside, 3 pages of hotel stationery. Dean's handwriting, shakier than it used to be, but unmistakable. "Kid," she read aloud, "I'm writing this because I can't say it to your face without crying, and we both know I don't do that shit." Sammy's visible eye focused on the ceiling, listening. "That night in 1954, when I gave you blood, the doctor pulled me aside first. Asked if I knew I was anemic, said my hemoglobin was dangerously low, had been for months probably, said donating a pint could trigger cardiac arrest, put the risk at 30, maybe 40%. Patricia's voice caught. She cleared her throat, continued. "They made me sign a waiver, legal paper saying the hospital wasn't responsible if I died on the table. I signed it at 3:47 a.m. Didn't think twice. Because watching you die would have killed me anyway. Slower, but just as sure. Sammy made a sound, half sob, half exhale. You don't owe me your gratitude, Sam. You don't owe me your friendship. You don't owe me nothing. But if you got any fight left, fight this thing. Fight like you fought that stage when your eye fell out. Because I can't lose you again. Not like this. D. The nurse folded the letter carefully, placed it on the bedside table. Sammy's hand reached out, touched the paper like it might disintegrate. His last words, recorded in Patricia's shift notes. Tell Dean. Tell him I fought. Tell him I'm sorry I forgot. He died at 2:18 p.m. on May 16, 1990. Dean Martin didn't attend the funeral. Couldn't. His daughter Dina found him in his study that afternoon, staring at a photograph from 1955, the Rat Pack in their prime, Sammy's prosthetic eye perfectly positioned, everyone laughing at something Frank had said. December 1995. 1 month before Dean's own death. Deanna Martin was sorting through her father's safe, organizing documents at his request. Birth certificates, property deeds, the accumulated paperwork of a 78-year life. At the back, in a security envelope, she found another letter. No postmark. Unsent. The paper had yellowed slightly, written years ago, judging by the ink fade. Addressed to Sammy Davis, Jr. Her hands shook as she unfolded it. Sam, I lied in that hospital letter. I did think twice before giving you my blood. First thought was, will this save him? Second thought was, what if it doesn't? What if I do this and you still die? And I realized, I'd rather die trying to save you than live knowing I didn't try. That wasn't heroism, kid. That was fear. Fear of living in a world where you didn't get a second chance. I never mailed this, because you never needed to know how scared I was. But I need to write it down. So when I see you again, wherever that is, I can tell you the truth. Saving you saved me too. You gave me a reason to be more than a drunk who could sing. You gave me a reason to be a man my mother would be proud of. So who really saved who? Dean. Deanna sat on the floor of her father's study, both letters spread before her, and understood something that neither man had fully grasped. The greatest acts of love aren't transactions. They're transformations. Dean hadn't just given Sammy blood and money and career saves. He'd given him proof that someone believed he was worth saving. And Sammy, in surviving, in fighting back, in becoming extraordinary, he'd given Dean proof that goodness mattered, that sacrifice meant something, that the world could be better than the cold machinery of racism and exploitation that had tried to destroy them both. The safe's combination, she noticed, was 08-12-25. Sammy's birthday. Dean Martin died on Christmas Day, 1995. Among his effects, 2 photographs of Sammy, a program from that March 1955 comeback performance with a bloodstain on the corner, and both letters, the one he'd sent and the one he couldn't. Some debts transcend repayment. Some friendships survive betrayal. Some love refuses to die even when everything else does. And some stories end not with answers, but with the recognition that the question itself, who saved whom, was always beside the point. What mattered was that when one man fell, another reached down. And in that reaching, both were lifted higher than either could have climbed alone.